Hey guys, welcome to episode 5 of the Treasures of Public Health History series with the Plague Professor. Have you ever wondered why milk is pasteurized? Well, today I'm going to tell you. It has something to do with a man named Louis Pasteur, who's a French chemist who lived in the 19th century. So, in short, pasteurization is a process that he developed to kill off pathogens or germs that lurked hidden in milk or other beverages or food. And here's a graphic of what the process kind of looked like. So pasteurization involved heating at relatively low temperatures and then cooling milk or other products. And the goal was to kill the pathogens without actually cooking the product. So maybe pasteurized milk seems like a pretty mundane thing to get excited about, but I'm excited. Why? Well, I'm going to tell you. So depending on where you live, I live in Chicago, so, pasteurized milk is pretty easy to get, and maybe we take it for granted. And raw milk is actually very difficult to find, and there's a good reason for that. So the reason being that raw milk, particularly when kept at room temperature, is the ideal breeding ground for some really nasty germs. Germs like salmonella, E. coli, diphtheria, scarlet fever, tuberculosis. The list goes on and on. Those are just a few. But these ended up being some pretty deadly diseases historically. So pasteurization actually ends up saving a lot of lives and preventing people from getting sick after drinking milk. And so we owe this debt of gratitude to Pasteur, but I think it's also important to mention that even though he's credited with inventing this process, he was not the first to come up with the idea that maybe heating foods could kill off these nasty germs in them. And so, in fact, there are records that in China, in the 12th century, they developed a similar process to prevent the fermentation of wine. And so they figured out that if you heated wine to a certain temperature, that you could kill off any sort of thing that would cause fermentation without actually destroying the flavor of the wine. Fast forward a couple of centuries later, there's evidence that they were doing the same thing in Japan. In the 15th and 16th century, there are sources that refer to heating liquids, heating wines or beverages to prevent fermentation. Flash forward then a few centuries later, in Italy and France and Britain, there are a number of scientists who developed this process of heating up food to preserve it. And so, a few decades before Pasteur, there's reference to people canning foods, basically putting foods in glass jars and boiling them at high temperatures to preserve them, to kill off pathogens. So there is a precedent for Pasteur. And also I should mention that, Pasteur didn't just wake up one day and say, "Ooh, I would like to learn how to make milk safer." He actually started out being more concerned with the fermentation process in beer and wine, and coming up with ways to figure out why beer and wine fermented, and he applied those principles to milk. And so fortunately for us, now it's pretty easy to get pasteurized milk. So one other thing I wanted to mention about the importance of pasteurized milk is that it is actually kind of tied to what would ultimately become the child health or child welfare movement, particularly in the United States, Britain, France, and Western Europe, because after pasteurization was developed in the 1860s, and again, we don't have a working germ theory until the 1880s, so it takes a little while to kind of take hold. But by the end of the 19th century, it became apparent that providing children with clean milk to drink would save a lot of lives. So in a lot of places in France, the United States, and Britain, they opened these milk clinics, essentially, these places, these centers where people could go to bring their kids to get clean milk. And over time, these milk centers kind of evolved into well-child clinics, and they became places where people could bring their kids to, get basic health care. Ultimately, they could only do so much before they started including vaccinations. But at any rate, I think it was a really important step in the process. So I'm just going to show you a slide of an image of one of these milk clinics in France in the late 19th century, so you can kind of get a sense of how they thought about this idea. So that's it for today. Plague Professor out. Stay tuned for more. I think I'm going to tell you more about the plague, more about germ theory. There's a whole lot more to come. All right, thanks for tuning in. Bye. This is an example of one of those milk centers in 19th century France. Thanks for watching. Plague Professor out.